The cemetery was silent except for the sound of a grown man breaking apart on his knees, his sobs raw and uncontrolled as if someone had torn his heart out with bare hands. And John Harrison, a man the world called a millionaire, pressed his trembling palms into the cold dirt in front of a small white gravestone that carried his daughter's name, feeling useless, empty, and ruined beyond repair, because no amount of money could buy back the tiny life he believed he had buried 2 months earlier. And as tears blurred his vision, he whispered her name again and again like a prayer that refused to be answered, unaware that only a few yards away, hidden behind a thick tree with cracked bark and tangled roots, Isabella was alive, shaking, starving, terrified, and watching her father cry for a daughter who was breathing, suffering, and fighting to survive. John's shoulders rose and fell violently as he traced the engraved letters with his fingers. The words "beloved daughter," "rest in peace," burning into him like a curse, and his chest tightened so hard he thought he might collapse right there beside the grave, because every second since the fire felt like punishment for failing to protect her, for letting her go to that cabin in the woods with Stella, the woman he trusted, the woman who had smiled gently and promised to take care of his little girl as if she were her own. The memory of that weekend replayed endlessly in his mind, the way Isabella had waved goodbye, clutching her tiny bag, laughing, alive and full of light, and then the phone call that shattered everything. The fire, the ashes, the unrecognizable remains, the personal items found in the rubble, and the way he had accepted the explanation without questioning it. Because grief does not think clearly, grief only consumes. Behind the tree, Isabella's fingers dug into the bark as she watched her father's body shake with pain, each sob slicing through her like a knife, because she wanted to run to him, to scream that she was alive, to throw her arms around his neck and never let go. But fear froze her feet in place, fear born from dark rooms, locked doors, and voices she had learned to recognize in the shadows. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure he could hear it, and tears streamed down her face as she whispered to herself that she had to stay hidden, because if they found out she escaped, they might hurt him too, and that thought terrified her more than the nights she spent alone in the dark. John pulled a small silver bracelet from his pocket, the one he had given Isabella on her last birthday, and he pressed it to his lips as if kissing her hand, his voice breaking as he begged the empty air for forgiveness, for one more chance, for one last hug. And Isabella bit her lip until she tasted blood, forcing herself to stay silent while her whole body screamed to move. When John finally stood, weak and exhausted, tucking the bracelet against his chest like it was the last piece of his soul, Isabella closed her eyes and leaned her forehead against the tree, knowing that moment would haunt her forever, because the world was too cruel to let them reunite yet. She waited until he walked away before slipping back through the cemetery and into the woods, her small body moving carefully through paths she had memorized, her steps light with fear, because the place she was being held waited for her return. The cabin was old and isolated, surrounded by trees so thick that even daylight struggled to enter. And inside, Isabella lived like a ghost, quiet, hidden, surviving on scraps, pretending not to exist. She had no sense of time anymore, only hunger, fear, and the constant sound of voices beyond the walls that reminded her she was trapped. That night, she lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, her stomach tight, her mind replaying her father's tears when laughter echoed from the other room, sharp and careless, and her body went stiff. Slowly, barely breathing, she slid off the mattress and crept toward the door, which was slightly open, letting a thin line of yellow light spill across the floor. She pressed her eye to the crack, and the words she heard shattered the fragile hope she had been clinging to. Stella's voice was calm, almost cheerful, as she said it had been 2 months and no one suspected a thing, that the fire had worked perfectly, and a man's voice laughed in response, low and cruel, a voice Isabella knew too well. Uncle Mark. Her chest tightened as she listened, her mind struggling to understand as Stella mocked John's grief, calling him pathetic for crying over a dead child, raising her glass as she spoke of inheritance and money. And then the word poison slipped into the air, casual and deadly, as Stella bragged about slowly killing John with every cup of tea she prepared. Isabella's vision blurred, her legs nearly giving out as terror flooded her body. Because in that moment everything became clear. The fire, the lies, the prison, the betrayal, all of it planned by the two people her father trusted most. She clamped her hands over her mouth to keep from screaming as Stella and Mark toasted to John's death, laughing like monsters wearing familiar faces. And Isabella stumbled backward into the darkness, her heart racing, her breath shallow, her childhood collapsing under the weight of the truth. She pressed her back against the wall, tears burning her eyes, realizing that her father was not only mourning her, he was slowly dying, and if she stayed silent, he would be gone forever. Fear still wrapped around her like chains, but beneath it, something new sparked to life, something desperate and powerful, the understanding that she was the only one who could stop them. And as the cabin fell silent and the laughter faded, Isabella lay back on the mattress, pretending to sleep, staring into the dark with wide, determined eyes, knowing that somehow she had to escape, because her father's life depended on it. Isabella did not sleep at all that night, because every time she closed her eyes she heard her father crying at the grave, saw his shoulders shaking, felt the unbearable weight of knowing he believed she was dead while she was trapped and alive, and the knowledge burned so fiercely in her chest that it hurt to breathe. The cabin felt smaller than ever, its walls pressing in like they wanted to crush her, and every sound, the ticking clock, the wind scraping against the roof, the distant hoot of an owl felt like a countdown. She lay perfectly still on the thin mattress, eyes open, listening as Stella and Mark moved around the other room, their footsteps heavy with confidence, with the kind of comfort that only monsters feel when they believe they've won. When Stella's laughter drifted through the wall again, low and amused, Isabella clenched her fists so tightly her nails dug into her palms, forcing herself not to cry, because she knew now that crying would not save her, and fear alone would not protect her father. The realization settled slowly but firmly: if she did nothing, John would die believing he had failed her, and she would live knowing she had failed him in return. As morning crept in through the cracks in the walls, Isabella made a decision that terrified her more than staying. She would escape today, not next week, not when she felt stronger or braver today, because every hour Stella lived freely was another hour. Poison could be poured into her father's cup. When Stella finally opened the door, her face arranged into that fake, gentle smile that had fooled so many people, Isabella forced herself to play her part, shrinking her shoulders, lowering her eyes, becoming the quiet, obedient child Stella believed she had broken. Stella set down a plate with stale bread and watery soup, reminding Isabella, in a voice sweet enough to rot teeth, that she was not to wander, not to touch anything, not to try anything stupid. Isabella nodded silently, because she had learned that obedience was a disguise, and monsters were careless when they thought you were powerless. The door locked behind Stella with a dull click, and Isabella waited, counting her breaths, listening as Stella moved about the cabin, humming softly, completely unaware that her lies had begun to unravel. Hours passed slowly, painfully, until the cabin fell into the deep quiet of early afternoon. Isabella knew this silence. She had memorized it. Mark usually left around this time, and Stella cleaned or rested, assuming Isabella was too frightened to do anything but sit and wait. When the sounds finally stopped, Isabella moved. Carefully, quietly, she slid the loose floorboard she had discovered weeks earlier, her heart pounding so hard she feared it would give her away. Inside the hiding place were the few things she had managed to collect: a bent nail she used as a tool, a scrap of paper torn from a magazine, and a tiny pencil stub she had stolen from Stella's bag days earlier, not knowing then how desperately she would need it. Her hands shook as she wrote, letters uneven but urgent, every word fueled by love and fear. "Daddy, I'm alive." Stella and Mark lied. They started the fire. "She's poisoning you. Please don't drink the tea. Please get help. I love you." When she finished, tears dripped onto the paper, smudging the ink, but she folded it carefully and hid it inside the lining of her shoe, because she knew that paper alone was worthless unless she survived long enough to deliver it. The escape itself felt like stepping off a cliff. Isabella waited until the cabin was silent, then slipped out the back door, flinching at the soft creak of the hinges, her breath shallow, her body tense. ready to run or hide at the slightest sound. The forest swallowed her immediately, branches scratching her arms, thorns tearing at her clothes, roots grabbing at her feet, but she didn't stop, because fear had transformed into something sharper now: purpose. She ran the path she had memorized from the rare times Stella had taken her outside, pushing herself harder than she ever had before, lungs burning, legs trembling, every step driven by the image of her father drinking another poisoned cup. Just when her strength began to fail, the trees thinned, and a narrow road appeared ahead like something out of a dream. Isabella staggered toward it, waving her arms wildly as a truck rumbled closer, and behind her, Stella's scream cut through the forest, furious and sharp, confirming that the illusion was over. Panic exploded through Isabella's body, but she forced herself forward, stepping into the road just as the truck screeched to a halt. An older white man jumped out, shock flooding his face when he saw her dirty, bruised, barefoot, shaking. Before Stella could reach the road, the man pulled Isabella into the truck, slammed the door, and sped away, tires kicking up gravel as Stella's screams faded into the distance. At the nearest town, everything moved fast and slow at the same time: police, paramedics, questions, blankets, food, while Isabella repeated her story again and again, her voice trembling but steady, refusing to let fear silence her now. Hundreds of miles away, John Harrison sat at his kitchen table staring at his untouched tea, his head pounding, his body weak, when the phone rang, and something deep in his chest told him his life was about to change forever. John did not remember standing up from the chair when the officer on the phone told him his daughter was alive. Later, people would say he staggered as if drunk, one hand gripping the edge of the table, the other pressing the phone so hard to his ear his knuckles went white, because his body had spent 2 months preparing to die and suddenly had to relearn how to live. He asked the officer to repeat it again and again, his voice breaking each time, afraid the words would dissolve if he stopped hearing them. And when Isabella's voice finally came through the line, small, hoarse, but unmistakably real, something inside his chest tore open and healed at the same time. He sank to the floor, sobbing without shame, whispering her name like a prayer answered: too late, but not too late, never too late. And when she told him she loved him and that Stella was poisoning him, the grief transformed into a cold, focused fury that cleared the fog from his mind. The tea on the table, still steaming, suddenly looked sinister, and John pushed it away so hard it sloshed onto the floor, realizing with sickening clarity how carefully Stella had played her role, how she had watched him crumble, how she had guided him toward the grave he believed held his child. He did exactly what the police instructed, left the house immediately, touched nothing, drank nothing, and as he was rushed to the hospital under protection, the tests confirmed what Isabella had risked everything to reveal: trace amounts of poison, carefully measured, slow enough to mimic illness, cruel enough to ensure he would die quietly, unquestioned. Another tragic widower lost to grief, while doctors worked to stabilize him, antidotes flushing his system. John stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment he had trusted Stella, every smile, every gentle word, now poisoned with hindsight. And he understood with terrifying clarity that his daughter had not only saved herself, she had saved him. Across town, Stella's plan collapsed in hours. She was intercepted trying to leave the state, her calm composure cracking the moment officers mentioned Isabella's name, her screams echoing through the station as handcuffs snapped shut around wrists that had once poured tea with steady hands. Mark was arrested later that night, evidence tying him to the arson, the fake remains, the falsified reports stacked too high to deny. And as the truth spilled out, the community reeled, shocked by the depth of the betrayal, horrified that a funeral had been staged while a child suffered in silence. News outlets swarmed, headlines blaring about the girl presumed dead who had escaped captivity. And John refused every interview, every request, because all he cared about was getting to Isabella. The reunion happened in a quiet room guarded by officers and softened by nurses who pretended not to see the way a grown man broke apart at the sight of his child. Isabella sat curled on a bed, wrapped in a blanket that dwarfed her, her face thinner, eyes too old for her age. And when John stepped inside, neither of them moved at first, fear holding them still, because hope had hurt them both before. Then Isabella whispered, "Daddy," and John crossed the room in 3 steps, dropping to his knees and pulling her into his arms, sobbing into her hair, his entire body shaking as if the last 2 months were finally tearing their way out of him. He kept saying he was sorry over and over, for believing she was gone, for not protecting her, for every tear he had shed at the wrong grave. And Isabella clung to him, crying too, telling him she wasn't mad, that she just wanted to come home, that she was scared he wouldn't believe her. In that moment, surrounded by strangers who turned away to give them privacy, John swore silently that no harm would ever reach her again, not if he had breath left in his body. The weeks that followed were a blur of courtrooms, therapy sessions, and quiet nights where father and daughter relearned how to exist in the same space. Stella and Mark were charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, arson, and fraud, their faces hard and unrepentant as evidence was laid bare, including Isabella's testimony, delivered with trembling strength that silenced the room. John sat behind her, tears streaming freely, pride and heartbreak twisting together in his chest as he watched his daughter speak the truth, no matter how painful. When the verdicts finally came down, long sentences, no chance of early release, there was no celebration, only a heavy, solemn sense of justice done too late, but not entirely, because Isabella was alive, and that mattered more than anything. Healing was not quick, and it was not simple. Isabella woke screaming some nights, trapped in memories of locked doors and whispered threats, and John would sit beside her bed until dawn if that's what it took, holding her hand, reminding her she was safe. He sold the old house without regret, unable to bear the shadows Stella had left behind, and they moved somewhere quieter, somewhere new, where the air felt clean and the past did not press so close. John learned to listen in ways he never had before, to notice the small signs of fear, to move at Isabella's pace instead of forcing her to keep up with the world. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to laugh again, real laughter, not the hollow sound of survival. On a crisp morning months later, John took Isabella to the cemetery one last time. He carried no flowers, only the silver bracelet he had once pressed to a gravestone, and together they stood before the marker that bore her name. John knelt and removed it himself, hands steady this time, telling Isabella that graves were for the dead, and she was very much alive. They left the cemetery together, hand in hand, the sun warm on their faces, and for the first time since the fire, John felt something close to peace settle in his chest. He knew scars would remain for both of them, but he also knew this: love had survived lies, fire, and poison. His daughter had walked through hell to save him, and he would spend the rest of his life proving that her courage had not been wasted.